Hello, and welcome to my fourth podcast. And this is going to be called The British Invasion and How the American Bands, American Guitar Groups benefited. So, before we start, I want to tell you that our sponsor today is Sony and Sony Watchman. Now, if you can imagine, television at the palm of your hand. Look at this. You can't see it. Look at that. I don't have it hooked up to anything, but you can watch television programming, though it's in black and white, television program anywhere. It's portable. This is amazing. Sony, the one and only. All right, so here we go, and I hope you enjoy it. Hello, my friends. I'm back. This is my fourth. I really count it as my third because the first one was, in the what I called in the beginning, and that kind of talked about what my interests were and how it came to be. And then the second one was the British invasion, and then I promised my third one would be how the American groups benefited from the British invasion, and that's what this episode's about. But in between that, unfortunately, Brian Wilson passed away, and I did kind of a special episode about Brian Wilson. So this really is my fourth, but I'll call it my third, my fourth. Who cares? So look, I'm starting to get really comfortable with all this. I'm still saying a lot, but it's it's a process, and I really enjoy talking to all you guys, and I know some of you make some comments, and I really appreciate the comments, believe me, and telling me what they would like to hear or what they would like me to talk about. Someone, and I didn't get the name, I never get the name, and I should. One suggested Paul McCartney's solo work and kind of go a deep dive into that and what I think, and that's a great idea, and I might do that next because that there's a lot of material there, and I'm very, how can I say it? I could be truthful. I'm the greatest Paul McCartney fan on earth, but I could be honest and objective. And I know that, some of his work was kind of like, okay, I don't know what you were thinking, or maybe there was a lot of pot involved, but nonetheless, I think that would be a really good segment. So I might do that next. We'll see. But nonetheless, what this episode's about is the British invasion and how the American bands, groups, benefited, and how they came to be because of the British invasion. In 1964, when the Beatles came out, as I mentioned in my previous podcast, I stated that everyone from England got a record contract and came to the United States, and it's pretty truthful. But there were, in the United States at the time, you didn't have a lot of bands performing. You had a lot of singers like Frankie Avalon and Dion Elvis even, and some of these others. But once the Beatles came out, they kind of put all those solo artists out of business, and there were very few. I'm going to call them guitar groups. Okay, that's what we're going to call them in this. Very few guitar groups from the United States that were hitting it big. So once the Beatles came, then everyone in the United States saw their success, and all the record companies saw their success, and they started pushing all these guitar groups to the forefront and giving them record contracts. I used to say to Rocco and Dominic that in the 60s, every group wanted to be the Beatles, wanted to be as famous as the Beatles, or more famous than the Beatles, or just like the Beatles. And that was the goal. But, of course that never happened. But a lot of these bands tried to imitate the Beatles, sound like the Beatles. A lot of these groups, the bass guitarist had the violin bass like Paul McCartney, just to show like, hey, we're just as hip as, the Beatles. Look we've got this bass that Paul uses, and we use it too. So, we had that, and that was awesome because there was so much good music coming out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover just a handful of bands that came to the forefront in 1965, because really it wasn't until 1964 was the British invasion. They were all British bands, and it took till 1965 for Americans to catch up. So these bands really got famous and got airplay in 1965. What I'm not covering in this is Motown, because they didn't really try to be the Beatles, except the Supremes did one British influenced album. I think the Supremes sing London Town, or the Supremes straight out of London or straight out of England or something like that, where they sang Beatles songs. But nonetheless, I'm not going to get into Motown at all. Also, I'm not going to get into the Beach Boys. And you would think, well, the Beach Boys were huge, but they were around prior to the Beatles, and they had hits prior to the Beatles, and they were a popular band in 1963 and 64. So I don't need to get into that, and maybe another time I'll do a Beach Boys podcast. If you guys like it, you have to tell me. Okay, so as you could tell, I'm loose, and I'm tan. Every day, not every day, every other day, I swim. And then the days that I don't swim, I walk. And I walk about 4 miles each day. So there. So I am ready. So, with that, let's start. And this isn't in chronological order at all, but just bands I think that were really influential and that I really liked, and I thought, like I said, benefited from the Beatles and the other British groups that landed in the U.S. in 1964. So, with that, first one I'm going to talk about are the Turtles. Now, they were a band that formed in Los Angeles. Their first big hit was the Bob Dylan song, It Ain't Me, Babe. That was in 1965. Then they had a hit called You Baby, and everyone knows this song, Happy Together. and she'd rather be with me. Now, the group, the Turtles, primarily consisted of the lead vocalist, Howard Kaylan, and backing vocalist, Mark Volman. Okay, their voices together, blended together, was like angels. They had management problems and lawsuits and conflicts with their record label, White Whale Records. And they really wanted to lose their record label or stick it to them anyway. So what they did is the big plan was their record label said, we need a new single. So Howard Kaylan and Mark Volman, and those guys are sarcastic, and they were characters. And they said, okay, and we're going to write the worst song possible. And it's going to flop because the lyrics are going to be so corny that the radio stations aren't going to play it. So they wrote a song, and it was called Eleanor. And the lyrics were, Eleanor G, I think you're swell. And you really do me well. You're my pride and joy, etc. Eleanor, can I take the time to help you to speak your mind? Tell me that you love me better. Your looks intoxicate me, even though your folks hate me. What do you say now, Eleanor? And then the closing lyrics was, Eleanor G, I think you're swell. Eleanor G, well, that ended up being their biggest hit ever. Their plan backfired big time. And it's an awesome song. And if you have a chance to Google it or listen to it on YouTube or something like that, go for it, because it is really, really a great song. Their songs are awesome. So, because of this, though, Eleanor came out in 1968. They had another song called You Showed Me in 1969, and then they called it quits. That's it. They broke up. Well, Howard Kaylan and Mark Volman, or Volman rather, joined Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention. Okay? But for contractual reasons, because they were still under, I guess, the contract from White Whale Records, and they're saying, well, you can't record with anybody else. They went under the name of Flo and Eddie. So this way they could avoid being sued and be able to record, with the Frank Zappa band. So they lasted there for a little over a year, and then they started to perform under the name of Flo and Eddie. And they really became kind of a comedy rock act. I mean, they never had a hit under that name, but they had several albums that I have, and I really enjoy them. But it's really a comedy act, because those two guys were characters. But they had such great voices that other artists wanted them to sing background for them. So they became like session musicians for John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, Hungry Heart. They sang background. Alice Cooper. I don't know if you guys have heard, I'm sure you have, maybe, T-Rex, Mark Bolan, T-Rex, um, the song Metal Guru. They sang the background vocals for them, and that's one of my favorite songs. In fact, it's my ringtone. But nonetheless, their vocals were so good that they worked, they did background vocals for a lot of artists. So they continued to tour as Flo and Eddie, and then I'm going to say maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, they started to tour again on these like nostalgia tours. I think they were called like the Happy Together tours, and that's still going on, Happy Together tours. But I think that even back then it was called that, and they would go as the Turtles. They were the only two original members, but they would still go as the Turtles. I need to put this up. But nonetheless, it it worked, and I'm going to say about 8 years ago or so, Howard Kaylan decided that he didn't want to tour anymore. And I don't know what it was, whether it was health problems or whatever, or maybe he was just tired. But nonetheless, he quit. And I mean, they still get, they were still friends, but they just stopped. He just stopped the Happy Together tour. And this tour, Happy Together tour, was with other acts like the Cowsills and the Grassroots and all these other 60s bands, a couple that I may mention here today. But nonetheless, so Mark Volman was continued, and about, I'm going to say about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, he got a unfortunate disease where he's just not right. He has bad memory problems. He'll be somewhere and he'll not know where he is, and things like that. But he continued to tour. And with that, he continued for until about 2 years ago, maybe even less than that, maybe a year ago, where now he doesn't tour anymore at all. But nonetheless, the Happy Together tour still exists, and they're coming to a town near you. So that's the story, the Turtles. Now, next band, and just so I can say, the Turtles were great. They were hot shot, and none of these bands really that I'm talking about were crappy. There might be one. The next band is the Rascals. Now, originally they were known as the Young Rascals, and then they were formed in New Jersey in 1965, and they had lead vocalist Felix Cavalieri and percussionist Eddie Brigatti, and then they had a drummer, Dino Danelli, and also Gene Cornish. Now, Dino Danelli, the drummer, just died about 2 years ago, but he was a twin of Paul McCartney. He looked just like him until he got older. Then that look kind of faded, but he looked very much in, whether it was intent, he had the mop top haircut and whatnot. But nonetheless, the Young Rascals were really popular. They're the ones. And then around 1966, I guess, they changed their name to just the Rascals. So with that, they had a ton of hits. And I know that you guys have heard some of these. Good Lovin', Groovin', People Got to Be Free, How Can I Be Sure, It's a Beautiful Morning. They called this type of music blue-eyed soul. And they were, you couldn't stop them. They were a great band, East Coast band, and I think they still kind of tour. Felix Cavallari and Eddie Brigati. I don't know. Felix Cavallari still tours. And I think maybe he names his band the Rascals. And I don't know if Eddie Brigati's in it. Gene Cornish wrote a book not too long ago. But nonetheless, they were nominated and inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame about 10 or so years ago, and they were a great band, but they were what I said would be considered blue-eyed soul. And if you have a chance, I recommend, if you haven't heard these guys that I'm going to talk about, give them a listen, because they are fantastic. Now, the next guitar band that I'll talk about is the Lovin Spoonful. And they were huge in the mid to late 60s, beginning in 1965 with the song, Do You Believe in Magic? And I know you've all heard that. Now, they hit that, and then they hit Daydream. Now, everything goes full circle. So, Paul McCartney heard the song Daydream, and you all know it. What a Day for a Daydream. He loved it, and so he thought, I'm going to write a song just like that. So he wrote Good Day Sunshine. That was directly from Daydream. Another hit was Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind? And then the massive hit, Summer in the City. John Sebastian was the primary songwriter. In 1966, they were the third best-selling singles act in the United States after the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Once psychedelia kind of expanded in 1967, they struggled to transition into that approach, and then they ended up breaking up in around 1968. I think they kind of continued without John Sebastian, and now his name John Boone was the drummer, and he continued, but that didn't last. John Sebastian ended up being a solo artist, performing at Woodstock in 1969, and he wrote the theme song to Welcome Back, Kotter, and he was the one who sang that. Welcome back, All right, I'm not going to sing it, but So anyway, they were huge, and I remember hearing their music, and it was like, here's the new song from Lovin Spoonful, and then the next song, and then the next song, and the next, and I thought, I really did think, they're going to be more popular than the Beatles. I really thought that. I was afraid. It didn't happen. Okay, so with that, and just a byline here, when I said psychedelia of 1967, kind of hurt them. The, Sergeant Pepper was the beginning of really brought psychedelia to the forefront, and it put a lot of bands out of business because that's what the audience was looking towards then. And also the British bands, I'm not just talking about American bands, but British bands too, because they were looking for that different kind of music, and a lot of these bands just couldn't keep up. So, John Sebastian, um, and the Lovin Spoonful weren't about that, so that's why they kind of faded. Anyway, but they were great and they were big. Um, another, so I'll talk about Paul Revere and the Raiders. Now they began in around 1960, 58, 59, 60. But they didn't become popular really until after the Beatles. But they used to wear Revolutionary War style clothes in their act. Now, the leader was Paul Revere. His actual name, though, was Paul Revere Dick. Can't go wrong with that. But he just went under the name of Paul Revere. That's why they dressed up in revolutionary outfits. He was the keyboard player, and they had a lead singer, Mark Lindsay. And they put out several singles, but none were really huge until they came out with songs like Just Like Me, Kicks, Hungry, gosh, I can't think, but Let Me. And these songs, in my opinion, were pretty heavy. I mean, listen to the song Kicks and Hungry and Just Like Me. And Mark Lindsay, or Lindsay, had his shtick was very much like Mick Jagger, the way he sang and danced and on the stage. And he wasn't a musician. He just held the microphone just like Mick Jagger. But in my opinion, they were pretty heavy. They were kind of like garage band-ish. And I really think that they should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Lovin Spoonful is, the Rascals are, the Turtles aren't, and they should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame also. But Paul Revere and the Raiders should definitely be in the Hall of Fame. What happened in later years, there again they came out with Indian Reservation. I think a lot of people know that. And then Mark Lindsay broke out as a solo artist and did a huge hit called Arizona. Now, Paul Revere and the Raiders continued to tour with Paul Revere as the keyboard player, but different members that weren't in the original hit-making Paul Revere and the Raiders. He would like to be called the madman of rock and roll. But his piano in later years, after the original band broke up, was the front was a Mustang grill. His keyboard and the Mustang grill in front of his keyboard. But they all still wore the Revolutionary War clothing. Um, they continued to perform as Paul Revere and the Raiders. Like I said, even though the original members, other than Paul Revere, would be in the band. Then, about, I'm going to say maybe 10 years ago, Paul Revere died. And now they're touring as Paul Revere's Raiders. Go figure. What do you want me to say? But, you can do that, and that's what they do. And everyone will look and go, oh, wow, we're seeing Paul Revere and the Raiders. And they sound just like the original, but there's not one person that's there originally. So, anyway. So with that, now we're going to kind of come into the nepotism side of rock and roll. First one would be Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Gary Lewis was Jerry Lewis, the comedian. It was his son. And he was a drummer. And his dad kind of pushed him out there. And he started the band with four of his friends. And he was, at first, it was Gary and the Playboys. But they added Lewis to refer them so people knew. They auditioned. They got their first job at Disneyland without telling Disneyland about his celebrity father. So they were just hired on the spot. And the Disneyland audiences just absolutely loved them. And they were playing to a full house every night. So everybody totally dug them. But nonetheless, in 1965, they had a huge hit called This Diamond Ring. They came up with other songs, She's Just My Style, Green Grass. And what was interesting is that in their band, there were a couple of very famous people who would move on to be in other bands. But for the most part, the musicians were from the Wrecking Crew, and eventually Leon Russell became a songwriter and arranger and pianist for Gary Lewis and the Playboys. We all know. But nonetheless, that became pretty popular, and they had quite a few hits. But and they got to, they kind of became the boy next door band. Not very non-threatening, and they were very well accepted. Jerry Lewis was. He wasn't a great father, and I think he kind of resented that side of his son. And there's an episode of, there used to be a television show called Hullabaloo, and it was a music show. And every week there would be a new host, and Jerry Lewis was the host one week, along with his son Gary Lewis. And he was just kind of a dickhead. And I don't know, but nonetheless, he still tours as Gary Lewis and the Playboys. So of course, no original members in the band other than just him. And I think he plays guitar now or something. The next Nepo baby, several, was, I'm just bringing them up. They weren't really a force like the other bands that I spoke about, but I have to. I would be remiss. Would be Dino, Desi, and Billy. Now, Dino was Dean Martin's son, Desi was Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's son. And then they had a friend, Billy Hinchy, and they all met in grammar school. And so they formed a band, and they auditioned for Frank Sinatra, who had informed Reprise Records. And that was a record label for Frank Sinatra and also Dean Martin. So they passed the audition. But they passed the audition and they had a record contract. They had several songs. I'm a Fool. Gosh, I can't. Can't a lot of their hits. But it was so interesting because Dino played the violin bass, and he was primarily the lead singer, and he wanted to be British so bad, or sound British, and whenever he'd say girl, he'd go, girl. But in the girl, it's embarrassing. But I'll tell you something. Dino Martin was a brilliant dude, and he could do anything. And he became a professional tennis player. He was he could hold his own as a bass guitarist, as a musician. And then he became a pilot in the Air Force. And unfortunately, his plane that he was piloting crashed into a mountain, and I don't know what year that was. It was tragic, and it was around 78, 79. But and it crushed Dean Martin. Dean Martin was never the same after that. But I wish I remember what happened. Noted when he passed away, but it was very tragic. Desi Arnaz was, his dad was an incredible percussion player and, bongo player for that much. And he became a fairly good drummer too. The real musician of the band was kind of the unknown, and that was Billy Hinchy. And he became the brother-in-law of Beach Boy Carl Wilson. And then Billy Hinchy began touring with the Beach Boys, and then later touring with Brian Wilson, and kind of becoming their band leader. And unfortunately, about 4 years ago, he passed away. He took care of his mother, who was ill, and he took care of her every day. And she passed away, and then not long after that, he died. And that was fairly sad, because he was a really good guy. Like I said, he was really talented. But that's, and then after they broke up, Dino had passed on. They started again. They reformed with Dino's other brother, or Dean Martin's other son, Ricky Martin, and it became Ricky, Desi, and Billy. And that didn't, I think it ended up, they played, in lounges and things like that. They never really did much. You just have to search for that. And then Ricky Martin died about 10 years ago, 15 years ago of cancer. So anyway, the only living member of that band is Desi Arnaz Jr. So there. So I've really covered several bands that were really popular and got their popularity in 1965 because of the Beatles invasion. But there's one band that I'm giving an exception to that started in 1966, and that is the Monkees, because they deserve it.
I thought love was
And they should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But the Monkees were formed in 1966 as a fictional band. They were put together by television producers for a fictional band to be aired on NBC, and they were going to call them the Monkees. Davy Jones, Mickey Dolenz, Mike Nesmith, and Peter Tork. Now, Davy Jones had success in England as a singer, and he was also in the stage production of Oliver. And he was on Broadway, New York, in the stage production of Oliver. And here's some irony. The very first performance of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, February 1964, they had a stage production of Oliver also on that show, and Davy Jones was on it. And he was on the same time as the Beatles. But nonetheless, there you go. So, what this was based on is a band that they were starving musicians, basically. And it was really kind of based on mania of what A Hard Day's Night presented. And Mickey Dolenz had to learn how to play the drums because he never played the drums before. I don't know if he ever played guitar, but nonetheless, they had to teach him how to play the drums. Davy Jones played the tambourine, so that's that. Peter Tork was actually a musician, and he could play guitar, bass guitar, banjo. And Mike Nesmith was a really good guitarist, musician, and songwriter. In fact, he wrote Linda Ronstadt and the Stone Ponies hit Different Drum, and that was a hit before the Monkees ever came around. But nonetheless, so Mickey Dolenz was also had his own television series called Circus Boy, and he starred as Mickey Braddock in that early 60s television show. So they were all, and Peter Tork was really good friends with Stephen Stills, actually. And Stephen Stills tried out for the Monkees, but Peter Tork beat him to that role. So anyway, so they were all talented people. So they weren't just, turnips. And they put out hit after hit after hit. Last Train to Clarksville, I'm a Believer, Daydream Believer. I mean, it was incredible. And they were really, you want to talk about competing with the Beatles in popularity, they were. And this was during the time, in 1966, 67, that the Beatles' output wasn't that much. I mean, 1966, they put out Revolver. I think that's it. And in England, they put out Greatest Hits also. But nonetheless, their output was very, very limited, other than singles. In 1967, same thing, really. Sergeant Pepper in June, and then they put out in July, All You Need Is Love is the single, and then December was Magical Mystery Tour. But they weren't putting out a lot of stuff, and the Monkees were putting out album after album after album, and song after song, and a little bit me, a little bit you, and just it was they were just huge. They became by their third album, or I'll say after their second album, they became very resentful of the fact that they really weren't allowed to pay their own instruments. Once again, the Wrecking Crew, that Los Angeles session musicians group, was playing most of their instrumentation. But they were kind of feeling their oats, and they wanted more control over their music and what they sang, how they sang it, and the instruments. So they came out. The first album was called The Monkees. Second was More of the Monkees, which I think might be the best. And then their third album, they got in a big fight with Don Kirshner, and they said, we want full control of the recording process. And this is in 1967. Because what the problem was too is they were having these hits, and they had these great songs, but they weren't getting really any respect. Well, they're just a TV band, whatnot. And they said, we want a little bit of respect here. So they did put out, the third album was The Monkees' Headquarters. And that was produced by the Monkees, and they played their own instruments. And once that happened, things kind of went downhill. They still put out another album, Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones. And once again, they produced and did their instruments and whatnot. And it was unfortunate because Call Gems, their record label, and Screen Gems, who owned the Monkees television show, wouldn't really let them take the Monkees name anywhere. I mean, they were kind of bound by them. And so whatever they did, they really kind of had to pay up. So eventually what happened is that one member, I think Peter left, and it was just Mike, Davey, and Mickey. And then Peter came back, and then it was just Davey, Peter, and Mickey. And then it was just Mickey and Davey. And still under the name of the Monkees, but it never went anywhere. Their last big hit was Listen to the Band. And I think that was 1968, maybe. 68 or yeah, I think it was 68, 69. But nonetheless, they were from 1966 really to 1968, 69 maybe. They were huge, and they were awesome. And my pitch is always put them in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because they deserve it. And they're very influential, and their music was influential, and everyone knows I'm a Believer, and I'm Not Your Stepping Stone, songs like that. And I'm Not Your Stepping Stone is pretty heavy. And so, there's a lot of bands in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, or a lot of artists that I feel don't really reflect rock and roll, but I really, I really think the Monkees do. And it's unfortunate because I don't think they'll never ever be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I mean, they're going with my opinion. I think for the most part, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has become kind of a joke. Anyway, so with that, I've kind of concluded my talk. I'm keeping this under an hour, so that's good. The whole thing is really, I didn't want to get into any solo artists because, once, they really didn't, try to be the Beatles, these solo artists, though they try to sound like the Beatles. And a lot of these artists tried to sound like Paul McCartney primarily. But because that was the most identifiable voice, really. But I didn't want to get into solo artists. And, you just, I can do that at a later time. But nonetheless, that is really it. So I just want to let everyone know that today's episode is brought to you by Sony Watchman. Just imagine having television at your fingertips in a screen like this. Look at this. It's amazing. You put up your antenna, amazing. Once again, the Sony Watchman. Okay, people. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Let me know if there's anything that you want me to talk about, bring up, and I will. I enjoy your comments. Try to get more people to subscribe to my channel. The more I get, the better it's going to be. And the more comments that I get, the more subject matter that I'll learn about that you guys want to hear. And we'll just keep going. And this is a lot of fun for me. And hopefully you guys are enjoying it too. Keep this going. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You guys are all so nice, and I know who you are. Okay? So have a great day. Have a great life.